So what I'd like to do today is, besides, uh, uh, well, let me just say from the outset, I think I've bit off more than I can chew. Talking about a presidential transition is a tall order. And there are many, many people that have been trying to guess what will happen in this next administration. It happens every time there's a change in administrations. What I'd like to do is give you a little bit of context here that will help us understand what might happen in this next Trump administration. Um, so let's see if I can advance this okay here. Please go ahead and start sending your questions in the chat or to Professor Shu. I'm not sure how you're going to handle that, but I've got quite a bit of material here and glad to stop and answer questions as we go through, however, to make it as interactive as we can over Zoom. So what I want to do is talk about, give you a little primer on the US government. I think probably most of you know at least some things about it, but I'll give you a little more detail about how things operate and how we're structured and how that will affect both the transition and what the Trump administration will do in its next term. And we'll talk about current clean energy trends and key laws that affect energy policy here in the US, climate and clean energy policy, the greenhouse gas reductions and Paris commitments. And then finally, I'd like to talk about, give you my thoughts on for US and China collaboration here over the next period. What I'll try to do is give you a sense of what will happen related to US climate and clean energy efforts in this new administration, and what that could mean for our cooperation. So hopefully this will be helpful. And if I haven't given you some of the information that you're or answers to some of the questions you have, please post them or ask them during our discussion periods. Okay, US government in transition, the branches of the US government. Just a reminder for many of you, if you've studied US government, there are three branches. These are co-equal branches. The legislative branch is Congress, has two bodies, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The executive, this is where the president and vice president sit, as well as all the cabinet members, the people who head up the departments and agencies that implement the policies of that administration. And then there's the judicial branch, which of course is a check on the laws passed, on the actions that are taken by the executive. It is the Supreme Court is the top of that pyramid, but there are a number of regional district level courts across the country that funnel cases up to the Supreme Court and handle a lot of the cases themselves without them going any further. All right, like I said, they're co-equal branches. They all have they were designed to have this an equal amount of power of sorts. They have different functions, but have they have different functions. The legislative branch develops and enacts laws. The Senate, there's 2 senators per state, so the 100 members that serve for 6-year terms that are staggered. So about a third of the Senate every 2 years is elected or runs for election. The House of Representatives has 435 members that are distributed among the states according to population, and they are elected every 2 years. So that's a very active, from an election standpoint, that's an even more active branch of the legislature. And then there's the executive is charged with implementing and enforcing laws. They can also recommend laws that the legislative branch enacts. And then the judicial branch chiefly determines the constitutionality of laws. Proposed laws in the legislative branch, which are called bills, can be introduced by either the Senate or the House. And eventually, though, they have to be introduced in both houses and the differences worked out and passed by both those houses or both those bodies and signed by the president before they actually become law. For instance, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was our big climate law that was passed a couple of years ago, was introduced in the House and debated and passed by both the House and the Senate. The differences worked out and became law when President Biden signed it in 2022. So this is a chart of the checks and balances. For instance, the legislative branch, as I said, introduces legislation. It can and enacts that legislation if it's approved by both bodies. It also can refuse, or it advises and consents on the choice of various presidential appointments, whether they are for the judiciary, judges, or they're head secretaries of different departments or agencies that are in the executive body or the executive branch. They can impeach and remove the president from office. The judiciary can rules on whether the presidential action is constitutional. They can do the same with laws. So they interpret laws and may declare laws unconstitutional. As I said, the power is balanced among these various branches, but recently, particularly since 2012, with closely divided Congress, it's been more and more difficult to pass some key laws like immigration and the budget. And so oftentimes the executive branch will try to enact policy through what are called executive orders. And these executive orders are only apply to the current administration unless the new administration decides to extend that order in its own manner. But it doesn't have the standing of laws that are passed by Congress. And those, executive orders can be repealed, as they often are. You will see a bunch of executive orders coming on the first few days of the Trump administration, as came with the Biden administration and the Trump administration before that, repealing or establishing policies that they ran for election on. Okay, the presidential transition affects the executive branch. Obviously, that's where the president sits and the vice president sit, and they in turn are nominating and Congress will have to approve their nominees for heading the various departments. The powers of the executive branch and authority are limited by the Constitution and by laws enacted by Congress. So the president can't step outside the legal bounds of those laws that are enacted by Congress or by the bounds of the Constitution. They're responsible for implementing the laws, such as the Inflation Reduction Act, as I just mentioned, the Clean Air Act that I worked with for many years when I was at the Environmental Protection Agency, energy efficiency standards that come out of the Department of Energy, for instance, and trade regulations that affect tariffs. The executive branch represents the U.S. in bilateral relationships and international forums like the climate COPs, the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change, and of course, oversee U.S.-China cooperation. I've talked about the executive orders to implement certain policies that, and then the heads of departments and agencies are nominated, as I said, by the new president and undergo review and approval by the Senate. So these are the elements, many of the elements of the transition of the executive branch. The key agencies that involved in climate and clean energy, I didn't put the Department of Agriculture here, but that's certainly an important piece. But the ones that I'm most familiar with and have worked with include the State Department, which oversees international policy, the White House itself, which has the Council on Environmental Quality, coordinating environmental policy across all the agencies, The climate czar, the climate and energy lead is often a member of the White House staff. This most recently was John Kerry. He's been our climate envoy for many years. John Podesta is that person now. They sit in the White House. The Department of Energy policy and science, research, technology, all gets done in that department. Environmental Protection Agency, that's climate policy and science. NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration both do quite a bit of very essential and important research on climate. That not only is available here in the U.S. but globally. It's an important resource for us all. Okay, this is what the electoral map looked like following the election. This election passed November for House seats. The main point of this is not to try to figure out what are red and blue. Red means these are districts, House of Representative districts that were represented by Republicans or elected Republicans, and the blue elected Democrats. Even though the geographic area of the red is much larger, actually the number, because this is a body that is based on population representation, the blue and red are almost equal in the House. There's 215 Democrats and 220 Republicans. That's an extremely slim margin to try to enact legislation on. And the same in the Senate. There's only a 3-member difference really between the House or between the Democrats and the Republicans. And what happens is in a closely divided Congress like that, it becomes, which has happened, as I said, since 2012, it becomes much more difficult to pass and repeal major laws. And what this means is that many of the laws that were passed in the Biden administration, and many of the regulations actually as well, because they will be challenged in this new Congress, it will be difficult to repeal those and to change those laws. So a lot of the progress we've made on climate over the Biden administration, we'll talk about this more, I think is actually in pretty good. I'm optimistic about many of the measures continuing to have an effect on our ability to grow our clean energy economy. One other, now the federal government is not the only government in the U.S. There's 50 state governments and many hundreds of local governments that are involved in the effort to address climate and implement clean energy policies. So we operate under what's called cooperative federalism, sharing power between the federal levels and the state levels. I don't think this is much different than what happens in China in a lot of ways, though the Communist Party has a much stronger hold on policy in China. There's still there are powers that the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, grants to both the states or to states that are different than for the federal government. The states often drive policy innovation. That's not different than provincial governments or provincial efforts in China and many other countries. For instance, California air quality policy and climate policy has been a driver of policy here in the U.S. There's also other states that have undertaken some interesting and innovative programs that have taken off at the federal level and informed our Inflation Reduction Act, the climate pieces of that act. In terms of climate, many of these states and local governments have set climate and clean energy goals. In fact, during the first Trump administration, many states, usually governed by Democrats, but not always, continued to implement clean energy policies and programs and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, resulting in continued national reductions in U.S. greenhouse gases. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but that was a significant effort, despite the fact that the Trump administration was downplaying climate and clean energy and pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. Okay, on this next slide, of course, states are a power block along with the federal government, but also there's the power of special interest groups across the board from many different angles in our political structure. So the federal and state governments exist within this ecosystem of special interests, often conflicting, almost always conflicting interests. There's people on both sides or all sides of a particular issue, whether it's clean energy, immigration, healthcare, and so on. And they try to exert power and influence over policies, programs, and government spending. Money plays an oversized role in these efforts, with paid lobbyists and other influence campaigns advocating for the interests of industry, of the financial sector, of healthcare, of energy, and so on. It's quite a mixture, complex mixture that's trying to sway Congress and lawmaking and at both the federal level and at the state levels and other levels to move things in the direction in their interest. But having a lot of money or more money doesn't always result in policy wins, because numbers, people voting, people writing their Congress, people showing up at various hearings and so on, can mobilize and push for a particular policy or program. That continues to be an important factor in our political structure. This chart shows a few of the grassroots organizations that are active in the U.S. There's hundreds more. These are some that I'm familiar with, or this very active set of environmental and climate justice organizations. I see Ma Jun he was on the Zoom when we first started, and I know he's speaking later. I'm sorry, I'm going to miss that, but I look forward to seeing the recording. His work in China is not unlike a lot of the work of these organizations in the U.S. Of just basically trying to raise the profile and the visibility of sustainability, of the environment, of protecting the environment, and the people who are affected, who care about it. So these movements have emerged in response to growing concern about climate change and its impact on U.S. and the planet. They come from many different parts of our society. Most are active nationally. Some are just small grassroots organizations in a local town or rural area. They focus on raising awareness, influencing elections and legislation, changing minds, developing new ideas and ways of working together and solving problems. They represent a significant political force for addressing climate and deploying clean energy. One of the compelling attractions of policies that come out of these groups, like the Green New Deal, which is featured here, it's part of the Sunrise Movement effort, is that it doesn't just focus on climate, but also on the social and economic inequality that is both a cause and a result of climate change and environmental destruction. All right, so that gives you a flavor of our government and some of the various forces that pressure our government to move in the direction that we want it to. Current clean energy and key laws is some of the result, and I'm going to cover that here over the next in my next section. So where does the U.S. find itself in terms of climate and clean energy laws and the progress we made now as we near the end of the Biden administration? This chart is from the Energy Information Agency administration. It shows the U.S. primary energy consumption by major sources over the last 73 years. Obviously, renewables are a small part of that over that long trend. You can see even particularly recently, since the mid-2000s, the decline of coal. There at the bottom, the growth of natural gas, methane gas, the continued use and expanded use of over the proportion of the consumption of oil in our transportation. That is our largest sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. The one we hope will speed even more rapidly its adoption of electric transportation. Renewables are growing, but need to grow much faster to meet U.S. climate and energy targets and keep us on track for our Paris Agreement obligations. In terms of electricity generation trends, you can see that, again, natural gas has taken over as a major generator of energy. That coal has dropped here since 2000. Solar, PV, hydro, and wind are the three major renewables that are taking on. And in that next chart, you'll see that, well, in a later chart, we'll show exactly how rapidly the renewable generation capacity is growing. I want to show this because it gives you a trend of the shutdown of the reduction in coal capacity over the past 2010 to 2025, expected last 15 years. One of the things that Trump ran on when he first ran for president was reviving the coal industry. It had declined under, as it showed, quite a bit in the years before he ran for election the first time. But in fact, coal capacity was shut down. More coal capacity was shut down in the first 3 years of the Trump administration than in Obama's last 4 years. So as you can see, quite a bit of coal has shut down. That is not because of regulation for the most part. It's because of the cost of coal and the economics of renewables and natural gas coming at that particular time. So given that Trump this time around ran on a platform, I'm getting an echo here.
Sorry, I don't know what happened.
Okay.
How about now? It's good?
Okay. Yep, sounds good now. The Trump ran for president this time on reviving the oil and gas industry and doing more drilling on federal lands. You should take that first, what he tried to do with the coal industry with a grain of salt, as we say. Remember what he said before, because he's promising to expand oil and drilling exploration on federal lands, but currently oil lease, there are many unused oil leases on federal lands. It's just not, the economics are not in favor of continuing to drill in these areas. It just costs too much, and the price of oil and gas is not sufficient. The current prices are not sufficient to justify that drilling. So again, the economics of this could affect delivering on this promise. One other thing I should say is during when people are concerned about whether we're going to shut down our ability to continue to grow our renewable sector. During the first Trump administration, 40 gigawatts of wind were installed and 30 gigawatts of solar were installed. I know that's small potatoes when it comes to China. China installs way more than that every year, but in the US, that was quite significant, and it reflects the economics of clean energy these days. And I think it will continue to grow even in this next Trump administration. Okay, here's the renewable energy trends I promised. As you can see, wind takes up almost half of our renewable portfolio here in the US, with hydro a little over a quarter, solar a little under a quarter, but growing quite rapidly. Solar thermal and geothermal are still a small percentage of our renewable energy capacity, but expected to grow as well. So overall, U.S. energy trends, this is from the International Energy Agency. U.S. is now the largest fossil fuel exporting country. We need to deal with that, and we'll see how that trend continues over the next few years here, with demand wavering in different parts of the world. From 2000 to 2023, crude oil production more than doubled. Natural gas production was almost doubled. Coal production was down almost 50%, and energy intensity of our economy was down 40%. And now renewables comprise about 20% of power generation, and are rising rapidly, as I said. Not as rapidly as it needs to, but still rising. In terms of major clean energy related laws that have spurred these developments and sort of helped to move our clean energy economy along, this includes the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which came through in November of 2021. It mobilized over $1 trillion to build and upgrade U.S. infrastructure, and that was infrastructure writ large. So sewer systems, aging sewer systems and water systems, roads, bridges, but also including the electric grid, the efficiency of public buildings and housing, and also spurring or facilitating the growth of renewable energy. The CHIPS and Science Act, this would authorize almost over $250 billion in new funding to boost domestic research and manufacturing of semiconductors in the U.S. Obviously, we were, with the supply chain disruptions and trade obstacles and trade difficulties that we've all run into, all countries have run into, trying to bring this manufacturing back into the U.S. was important. It also incentivizes domestic production of materials that are essential to scaling up the U.S. energy transition. The Inflation Reduction Act, it is the largest climate investment in U.S. history. It was passed a little over 2 years ago, and it mobilizes also over $1 trillion for scores of programs, including a variety of direct subsidies, tax credits, and other financial incentives to advance clean energy. This passed with a razor thin margin, and the key senator who, in an evenly divided Senate, senator from one of the energy states, West Virginia, coal state, he explained his support for this climate change bill by referring to American energy independence and his fear that fear of relying on China for the critical minerals of our minerals that our economy needs to make this transition. So you can see that China plays an outsized role in our efforts to try to advance our clean energy economy. All right, the Inflation Reduction Act funding since it was passed in August of 2022. as you can see, these billions of dollars are flowing out to state and local agencies. It's flowing out to green banks that are helping to continue to set up loan programs. It's out to nonprofit organizations and to industry that is undertaking clean energy projects. So this represents the cumulative climate implementation over these past 2 years. It includes grants and loans, but it doesn't include what is expected to be the largest funding stream, which are tax credits. Overall, $663 billion of the law's climate action investments are embedded in the federal tax code. So they're tax credits, investment tax credits, production tax credits, and so on. It invests $12 billion in electric vehicle incentives, $14 billion in home energy efficiency upgrades, $22 billion in home energy supply improvements, and $37 billion in advanced manufacturing. So lots happening in that world, and that's one of the reasons that I'm positive or more optimistic about many of these programs continuing. The clean energy boom over the past couple of years since these laws have really taken effect, companies have announced in advance 646 new clean energy projects. It's created hundreds of thousands of new jobs and $372 billion in investments across the U.S., including new battery manufacturing sites, new or expanded electric vehicle manufacturing facilities, solar and wind manufacturing plants. Most new clean energy projects are located in congressional districts represented by Republican members of the House of Representatives, which also means that they will likely be pressured by these companies and the people whose jobs depend on these companies to continue these incentives and continue this effort to build a in-country clean energy manufacturing base. This money goes to low-income communities. And also into rural America as well. This is where a lot of these investments have happened. It doesn't include the Northwest, which this particular analysis hadn't gotten that information yet, or that hadn't taken hold yet. But there's a number of new projects up in Washington and Oregon and Idaho that aren't reflected here. It's energized, really, literally billions of dollars of clean technology manufacturing, and as I said, it doesn't include these Northwestern investments. And much of these manufacturing plants are in rural areas where jobs are needed, and investment is going to bear fruit here. This shows the growth in battery storage. Of course, China has been a leader in this, leader and innovator in this, and the U.S. is trying to catch up. The annual U.S. cumulative installed battery capacity as of November of last year, so this is a little bit old. This is from the Energy Information Administration. In gigawatts, you can see it's growing considerably. It's expected to double this year. We'll see what comes out in a few days here or next month. And I expect it'll grow even more in 2025. And record growth in EV sales. Again, China dwarfs the rest of the world in terms of its EV market. So I'm very proud of this, but I also know how much the Chinese EV market has grown recently and how much is in sales. It's in part because, like the U.S., subsidies have been provided. Various incentives are in place in China to encourage EV sales. Those incentives have made a difference here in the U.S. I just purchased a used EV and got a $4,000 tax credit as a result of purchasing that EV. So I'm looking forward to enjoying that new EV or that used EV. U.S. electric vehicle market continues to rapidly expand. There's both new and used EV sales. In September, they exceeded 100,000 units for the sixth consecutive month, and that represents 9% of new vehicle sales. As the price gap between electric and internal combustion engines narrows, EVs are becoming more accessible to a broader range of consumers, boosted by strong incentives in the new vehicle market. In a country that's been dependent on oil for over 125 years, I'm heartened by this change. Some would say we've been addicted a bit too long, but overall, this is a major shift, and I'm looking forward to seeing in the next decade what happens. One of the things that just earlier this week, EPA granted the California the right to ban sales of new gas cars in 2035. This is a big milestone. We'll see if it's upheld in the courts. But I think it's promising because this California waiver allows California to have more stricter rules as a result of harder to solve pollution problems that have spanned many decades since the Clean Air Act was passed and even before. So they've always had the right to have stricter guidelines and rules than the U.S. as a whole. But it is the largest vehicle market, and there's 11 other states representing a total of 40% of the vehicle market in the U.S. that also follow these emission rules. So California definitely drives, no pun intended, drives the U.S. auto market. Oil companies don't want this. Obviously, it'll reduce their profits, but auto manufacturers love it because they know they will not be relevant globally. Their market will shrink globally if they are not not on the leading edge of the EV auto development curve. All right, let's talk about greenhouse gas reductions and the Paris pledges. I'll include a little here about China, but mostly talking about the U.S. Historical greenhouse gas emissions. This is from Climate Watch. China, obviously, it's grown. This is since the early 1990s of the past 20 or 30 years. China's obviously grown its share of greenhouse gas emissions. U.S. share has shrunk, even though the U.S. still has historically the most emissions since the Industrial Revolution. China's is growing, actually. While it's not shown on this chart, the EU's overall historical emissions now dwarf or not now are exceeded by China's historical emissions. So we all need to be working together to reduce all of these emissions. This just gives you a sense of where those emissions are coming from at this particular point in the trend. U.S. greenhouse gas emissions trends in the forecast here. This is from the Rhodium Group. Obviously, they've been going down. They're not going down fast enough. But it looks like at this point, the high, mid, and low ranges reflect an uncertainty around fossil fuel prices. This is the forecast: prices, economic growth, clean energy, technology costs, and supply constraints. And then the data center growth. Data centers are, with AI, artificial intelligence centers are becoming quite the energy hogs. With all the federal and state policies on the books as of 2024, this analysis estimates that the U.S. is on track to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 38 to 56% below 2005 levels by 2035. representing a 2 to 4 times increase in the pace from 2005 to 2023. So our installation of and replacement of fossil fuel by renewables hopefully will, and the adoption of EVs, among other things, will keep us on track, hopefully there. Just today, the Biden administration announced a new NDC of 61 to 66% reduction from 2005 levels in 2035. So we're not on track to get there, and we'll see what the Trump administration does with that particular commitment. But it will definitely be a stretched goal for the U.S. that I hopefully we will the economics and politics will line up to achieve that goal by 2035. Can we meet the Paris commitments? So this is both we, meaning both China and the U.S. These are modeled domestic pathways done by Carbon Tracker. They reflect global economic efficiency perspective with pathways for different temperature ranges derived from global least cost models. I don't know a lot about these models, so if you have questions about that, I can point you to Carbon Tracker. But let's look at what the U.S., the model pathways for the U.S. Right now, as you've seen, U.S. peaked its emissions in the mid-2000s since 2005, trying to reduce those by 2/3, optimistically by 2/3 by 2035. The 2030 NDC target, it seems it's almost sufficient. The current policies are almost sufficient to achieve that target. But of course, this is analysis that does not include those new commitments for 2035. In terms of China, the historical emissions continue to go up, but it's expected to peak soon. Fingers crossed we get there, China gets there, and that'll be good for China and for the world. And but Climate Action Tracker doesn't think current actions are sufficient to achieve that NDC target. Both the U.S. and the Chinese targets are above what's needed for Paris to achieve 1.5, and it's very close to what is and it's above what's needed for a 2-degree stabilization target. So let me see if there's anything else here that I wanted to mention. I think recent projections suggest, or despite the expansion, coal plant utilization rates in China are declining with coal share of electricity, or in the U.S. or declining with coal. In China, they're declining with coal share of electricity generation falling to just about half in May 2024 from 60% a year before. So as renewable energy and hydropower recover, I know that's a difficult tension now between coal capacity and coal installations and renewables, but I'm glad to see that China's making the adjustments to bring more and more renewable online and into the grid. So let's here are my thoughts. These are wide-ranging. Hopefully they're helpful. My thoughts for U.S. and China collaboration. The big question is, will the clean energy boom continue under Trump? I've already told you I'm optimistic that it will. This closely divided Congress makes changing major laws much more difficult. There's broad, as I said, bipartisan interest in continuing many of the programs and incentives enacted by Biden. Economics generally favors continued move away from fossil fuels, but polarized politics. The fact that there are still many people that it's politically safe to say that climate change doesn't exist. that it's a scam, that yeah, that and that it is in some ways a cultural battle rather than a scientific and economic battle. It means that there will be support for removing clean energy subsidies by the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry would love to keep its own subsidies and end subsidies for clean energy. Electrifying the US economy will continue to increase electric power demand, and that creates significant challenges both for electric generation and distribution. Can we handle that? Can the US handle that with renewables, with more and more renewables and battery storage included in that? Reducing inflation is what Trump promised. It's what he ran on. It's what got him elected for the most part. He also promised a tariff on foreign goods, and you all have probably heard about that at your end. Um, those priorities are conflicting, would be conflicting. Tariffs, most economists believe that if tariffs are placed on a lot of foreign goods, the US depends on foreign goods from China and from a lot of other places. If those tariffs are put on foreign goods, that raises prices here in the US and continues making inflation harder to tame. Coal will continue its long decline in the US. I think that's pretty certain. We don't depend on coal the way China does. We have gas and oil, but I think given the economics of renewables, it's more and more competitive to pursue renewables as well. Tariffs affecting trade with China could also slow US uptake of renewables and electrification. There are a number of things that a number of products that are still needed from China for clean energy, a range of things, and so putting tariffs on that will make it harder. Uncertainty for incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act for domestic clean energy investment, production, and consumption. That will also affect the speed of the transition away from fossil energies. Which of these incentives remain? I'm optimistic many of them will, but some are likely to get repealed in the efforts to cut costs, cut the overall federal budget, which is another priority for the Trump administration, the incoming administration. We'll see which ones of those survive. Expect significant opposition to changes to climate and clean energy bills. That opposition will come from civil society and from many of the states and companies and businesses that depend on clean energy growth. So you'll see that. You'll see a lot of activities from these various grassroots groups and other national groups that will be active in the clean energy space. You should also expect continued progress at city, state, and regional levels. That, as I said earlier, that was true under the first Trump administration. It's been true in the Biden administration. It will continue to be true. And those goals and targets are more and more ambitious as years go on. The possibilities for cooperation. Well, there's certainly some mechanisms that we have tried to undertake in the past 4 years. In the larger climate space, global climate space, US and China can together exploit these opportunities for investments in clean energy technology and resiliency. There's a lot to be said there. Through platforms such as this US-China Working Group on Enhancing Climate Action. We'll see how that does in the next administration, but that's hopefully something can happen there. And build on these recent joint declarations, the Glasgow Declaration and the Sunnyland Statement, both in trying to enhance climate action, particularly in the area of methane, which I know Professor Hu has been working on diligently. It's going to be important, particularly around the issues of trade and security. that we do everything we can at our levels to reduce the tensions in our relationships. The peer-to-peer dialogue, such as this forum, need to happen often, often as possible. I know there's many of people on this side of in the U.S. that would enjoy and appreciate and be glad to participate in those forums, whether they be on in a virtual situation like this or by traveling as well. So hopefully that can happen. These track 2 diplomatic dialogues are very important for maintaining sanity. And while up above us is, there's a lot of, as we say, chest thumping and promotion of nationalism on all sides. So U.S. barriers to engagement with China on clean energy for us personally for the U.S. risk reducing innovation in climate action and increasing costs all the way around. So I think there's a lesson there for China as well. Just trying to engage as much as possible will as we've all talked about, I think for the past 20, 30 years since we really have taken on climate as an important policy effort, that it is a global problem that will require global solutions. And where can China be a global leader? I think these are my thoughts. I think it does depend on China continuing to lead in the deployment of clean energy. You all have been the major manufacturers of solar panels, of wind turbines, of EVs now. There's all this technology and manufacturing know-how that other countries need to learn and need to benefit from. The globe needs that kind of leadership if we're going to meet. If we're going to do what Professor Walling said, which is to deliver a planet, a safe and flourishing planet to future generations, helping to build renewable electric power capacity so every country can be energy independent, particularly when it comes to renewables. There's countries, many countries don't have oil, gas, don't have access to fossil fuels. Solar, wind, water, geothermal, battery storage, and the supporting infrastructure, they can use all of that. And that can be done through things like the Belt and Road Initiative and other initiatives, bilateral initiatives, engagement with developing countries where this is needed yesterday. Expand funding for clean energy innovation and deployment in developing countries hungry for electricity. So there's this financial support for the transition. And I'm emphasizing both here in the US and in Europe and in China, any country that has money has the resources to contribute here. We, of course, underperformed at this last COP in terms of the financial mechanism, but we all need to step up here to give grants to these countries. They are suffering from the burdens of loans, the World Bank loans, IMF loans from the West, as well as loans that are coming from China, and those loans need to be forgiven. We need to consider forgiving those loans because they're taking up all the extra space, all the extra resource that these countries can muster to not just to address climate impacts, but also to build their own energy infrastructure. I'll leave you with this quote from Hannah Ritchie. Hannah Ritchie is a young person, my daughter's age actually, a senior analyst for Our World in Data, and she's written a book recently about the possibilities of global cooperation on a number of sustainability issues, including climate change. And she talks about a massive solutions vacuum for our environmental problems. The early movers in this space can build a prosperous economy while building solutions to our problems at the same time. Countries can grow by leading the way on good, clean energy, good, and I put clean energy here, that's good technologies, not just exploiting polluting ones. So this is the challenge before us, is to really enable the developing world, which represents, as you saw on that chart, a considerable proportion of the emissions and the growing proportion of emissions of greenhouse gases. And we've got the resources and the technologies that can help those countries uh, um, develop a clean energy future for themselves and for the globe. So thank you. 谢谢.